Good afternoon. It is good to see all of you here this afternoon. My name is Kay Scarborough, and I'm the senior pastor here at First United Methodist, and we are glad that you are joining us for this conversation this afternoon. And I'd like to welcome and introduce to you the Reverend Mark Holland. Mark and I have known each other for a few years, so we could probably tell stories in each other, so we won't. We'll just leave it at that. Mark is a third-generation United Methodist pastor, and he has served in the former Kansas East Conference, now the Great Plains Conference, and I know that he was at Trinity, right, in Kansas City, Kansas. He was at Wathena, Elwood.
Wow, very impressive.
Yeah. He dealt with some bats up there at that time.
We did.
Yes, I remember that. And he is the executive director of Mainstream. And so he is well-versed in what is happening in our United Methodist Church. He has also been a delegate to our general conference from the Great Plains and the former Kansas East Conference for many years now. And Mark, I have found to be one who is a good advocate for things, one who considers things thoughtfully, and one who is ready to take action when needed. And so we welcome you, Mark, and we look forward to what you have to share with us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to use this one.
You don't need that. Oh, I forgot to mention that Mark and I were the class of elders of 1999.
That's right. The two of us.
That
was the
it.
Whole class right here.
The misfits.
That's right.
That's right.
That's right. I am concerned that the person in the front row carried a really heavy rock up here. So I'll take note. I think I'll stand up here because it's a little easier to see folks. Is that all right? Well, thank you, Kay. I appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate Ann for helping to organize this, and for all of you for coming out today. And we planned it right because there just aren't any more football games for the Chiefs to win, right? So we just have to, at some point they have to stop winning so we can do other things on Sunday afternoon, right? So it's good to see you all, and I aspire to do three things today. I want to tell you a little bit about how we got to where we are in the church, and I want to tell you a little bit about the legislation that's coming before General Conference this coming year, and then I will talk about some paths forward from there. So I'm going to give you a lot of information. There will be a test afterwards, so pay attention. But I really appreciate it. And I appreciate Lawrence First. You all have been strong supporters of Mainstream UMC, and I really appreciate that. And you've been real advocates in our conference for a long time for justice. And so I really appreciate the long-term work that this church has done, not only in the Lawrence area, but as an example across our conference. So thank you for the work that you consistently do. So I am a third-generation pastor, notable for this conversation in three different denominational structures. My great-grandfather was M.E. South. My father was Methodist, and I was born and ordained into the United Methodist Church. So we have, it is worth noting that the denominational structures do change over time, yes? And all three of us served in Wyandotte County at some point. So they had a hard time getting rid of us. But we have three generations in Wyandotte County serving. How did we get to where we are? What we're talking about right now primarily is the United Methodist Church's restrictions on ordination and marriage for LGBTQ persons, right? That's the primary issue that we're facing right now. And a lot of people wonder, well, is the United Methodist Church, is there something wrong with it? And people always tell me as a pastor, you know, I have a lot of problems with the church. And I always interrupt and say, I have more than you do. But folks wonder, I don't know, do any of you have friends who are Lutheran or Presbyterian? I confess I do as well. And the Lutherans, Presbyterians, Episcopalian, UCC all removed restrictions for ordination and marriage 12 to 16 years ago. And so the question is, why is it that the United Methodist Church has not? And the short answer to that is, if it were a U.S.-only vote for our church, we would have done the same thing 12 or 16 years ago. But our unique structure, international structure, is a reason. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got to where we are. So the story starts in 1972. the delegates at General Conference decided that there was a prohibition for clergy. You could not be divorced. And if you were divorced, you had to give up your credentials, and you couldn't be a pastor anymore. Well, they decided in 1972 they weren't going to do that anymore, that their hearts had changed, so now you could be a divorced pastor, but they added in prohibitions against being gay. And they said, at that point, they added language that says homosexuality is, quote, incompatible with Christian teaching. And that language was inserted in 1972, and it has persisted to this day, and there have been efforts every 4 years at General Conference to remove that language. So General Conference is the global body of the church. After the Revolutionary War, it was unpopular to be British, so the Church of England became the Episcopal Church, and the Methodists, who were part of the Church of England, became the Methodist Episcopal Church. And we formed a new denomination in the U.S., modeled after the U.S. government, which seemed like a really good idea 250 years ago. But we have an executive branch, which is the College of Bishops. We have the judicial branch, actually, that was not added until 1939, but we have a judicial branch. And then we also have the legislative branch, which is the General Conference. And unique, our legislative branch is the branch that holds, quote, the magisterial authority of the church. It's the only group that can change the rules of the church. So that's the group that holds most of the power, and it is a group of up to 1,000 delegates. Currently, it's 862 delegates, divided proportionally half clergy and half lay, and it's based on annual conferences all get at least one clergy and one lay representative. But it's also based on the number of clergy in a conference and the number of lay members of a conference. There's a formula that determines how many delegates go to General Conference. It meets every 4 years, unless there's a pandemic, but it theoretically meets every 4 years. And by the way, no one ever considered the idea that that might not happen. It never occurred to anyone we might not be able to meet for General Conference, and there are no provisions for budget, for people rolling off of committees. I mean, people just had to stay on the committees till they died. Anybody been on that committee? Yeah, it's common in the local church, but the general church, it never happens. So we have all these provisions that we never thought of have really paralyzed the church. So in 1972, this language was introduced. In the 90s, they realized that there might be gay pastors. So they introduced prohibitions, and they said a pastor cannot be a self-avowed practicing homosexual, which basically just introduced don't ask, don't tell into the church, which has its own destructive implications for people. Then in the early 2000s, they realized gay marriage was becoming popular and legal in this country, so they introduced provisions prohibiting pastors from doing gay weddings anywhere, and for churches couldn't host them in their churches. So, and then they thought, someone might want to fund the gay agenda. I'm not really sure what that is, but we shouldn't fund it, right? So somebody thought we shouldn't fund that. So they put in a funding ban that said you can't give any money that would support gay and lesbian ministries. So these provisions have been adding up over time. Well, in the 1980s, about 8% of the delegates to General Conference were from outside of the United States. Today, it's 45%. In 4 years, it will be 55%. So how did we get from 8% to 45% since the mid-80s? Well, there was a change in practice, not a change in policy. There was never a vote taken to change the way we do it, but there was a change in practice. Prior to the 1980s, when a church outside the United States reached a certain size, it would become autonomous and become an independent United Methodist Church. Now, there's a lot of reasons to that. Actually, I just gave a presentation in Washington, D.C., and this woman was describing to me that long process, which would take up the rest of our time to describe the whole thing. But there used to be a process for how that happened and why it happened. But if you think about it, all the Methodists in Mexico, Central America, and South America are all autonomous Methodists. They're not under the United Methodist Church because they came of age before the 1980s. The same is true of India, China, Korea, and Australia. Now, Australia came out of the British church. Those Methodists did, so we're not responsible for them. But all of those are independent Methodists because they came of age again before the 80s. In fact, according to the World Council of Churches, there are 10 million Methodists in Africa. 5 million are autonomous Methodists, and 5 million are United Methodists, because the autonomous Methodists, again, their annual conferences became autonomous before the 80s. So what changed? Why did we suddenly decide, instead of having churches become autonomous, to incorporate them into the church? Well, there's really three reasons. One of them is a good reason. The one reason is the United Methodist Church in this country is about 85% white middle class. Yeah? And adding global diversity matters. It makes the church a richer church. But the other two reasons require increasing levels of cynicism, so you can decide how cynical you're feeling today. One is the United Methodist Church, and it's more fun to say when my dad's actually sitting here. The United Methodist Church started to decline in 1965, which is actually the same year my dad came out of seminary. The correlation is undeniable, right? It's undeniable. But the church began to decline. By adding churches from outside the United States, we were no longer a declining denomination. We were now a growing denomination. Right? The second reason or the third reason that requires, but the second one that requires cynicism, is there were some folks at General Conference who realized these folks from outside the United States provided reliably conservative votes at General Conference that helped to keep the church more conservative than it would have been organically if it were just in the U.S. That's real. So the growth began, and churches began to be incorporated into the church, and the restrictions have grown accordingly. And we've reached a point now where it's 45% of the votes. Now, it would already be 55% of the votes by true numbers. But the General Conference, the church outside the United States, particularly in Africa, has grown so quickly that the General Conference actually stepped in proportionally. So there's a different formula that expires this year, and the next year it's based on the true population. So because of the stepped-in nature, the U.S. church still has additional votes that we wouldn't have otherwise. We also have additional votes because with the disaffiliations, we've lost 25% of the churches in the United Methodist Church in the USA, but the General Conference did not take away 25% of our delegates. Most of those people who left the church resigned, and we had a lot of people who are centrist and progressive take those positions. So the U.S. right now has 25% more votes than we should have, plus the step-in, which is why the U.S. represents 55% of the votes right now. But in 4 years, when they do the new math, we will be deducted for the 25% we've lost through disaffiliations, and the true count outside the United States will take full effect. So it'll go from 45% outside the U.S. to 55%. That creates some urgency for this General Conference. Mainstream UMC, we have 3 priorities. The first priority is to remove the harmful language from the Book of Discipline. That has Part A and B. Part A is the revised global social principles. You may have seen or read about these. There's been a big effort. It was an 8-year process across the world to redevelop these. But it takes out the language, homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. So if we're going to take the language out, we need to adopt those, the new resolution, Book of Social Principles. Social Principles. The second part of removing the language is repealing the traditional plan and all of the other things I mentioned, the prohibitions on ordination, the prohibitions on weddings, the prohibition on the funding ban. And I'll just give you an example about the funding ban. In 2016, there was a petition brought to General Conference when we were in Portland, and that petition said that the UMC should invest resources in preventing teen suicide among LGBTQ teenagers, because we know that LGBTQ teenagers have a suicide rate about 5 times higher than the rest of the population. That petition failed. So that if we can't work together to prevent suicide, what are we doing? Honestly, what are we doing? So these issues have come to a head a number of times. But removing all that language is a huge priority for us. The good news is removing that language only requires 50% plus one. And I'll come back to the math in a minute. But it requires a majority vote, which I believe we have. The second priority we have is for regionalization. And regionalization is an effort to allow for different regions of the world to make rules that fit their cultural place, which is why churches always became autonomous before, right? They didn't want to live under a U.S. book of discipline, and the vast bulk of our book of discipline is U.S.-centric. That issue came to a head in 2012 when a provision was passed called Paragraph 101. And what Paragraph 101 does is it takes most of the book of discipline and puts it into regional control. So churches outside the U.S. can adapt to the book of discipline to fit their culture. That's not reciprocated to the U.S. And it's because of the old colonial structure of our church. The U.S., according to our book of discipline, the U.S. church is the real church and everybody else is a satellite of it. Well, that's extraordinarily patronizing and colonial, isn't it? But that's how it was set up. Regionalization would actually remove that centrality of the U.S. church, and we would be one region among many, and each region would have the ability to adapt the book of discipline to fit their culture. So it's very important. The traditional plan that was passed, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute, the traditional plan that was passed in 2019, 60% of the votes to pass that came from outside the U.S., and it only affected the U.S. church because the rest of the world it was in the paragraphs that the rest of the world could adapt in or out of. So we are asking in the U.S. for the same reciprocation of regionalization that the churches outside the U.S. already have. The challenge to that is in order to decentralize the U.S. church, it takes 8 constitutional amendments. Constitutional amendments require a 3/4 vote at General Conference, plus ratification afterwards. And I'll come back to the challenge of that. But that's our second priority. One is removing the language, A and B, social principles, and repealing the traditional plan. The second one is regionalization. The third piece is to not reopen paragraph 2553 to continue disaffiliations. We want to end the disaffiliations in this country and move forward. So the disaffiliation piece, and this is one area where our coalition is not entirely of one mind. There are 2 schools of thought. One is, from a philosophical perspective, look, we don't want folks that don't want to be here, right? We don't want to hold anybody hostage. If you want to leave, leave. Philosophically, I agree with that. Practically speaking, that philosophy comes from annual conferences that were not hit hard by disaffiliations. Right, for annual conferences that were hit hard by disaffiliations, and I would say Great Plains was hit medium. We lost 25% of our churches, but it was mostly rural churches, small rural churches, and it only affected about 10% of our attendance and membership and budget for an annual conference. Other conferences like Texas lost 50%. Northwest Texas lost 80%. And we have the exact same divide with disaffiliations that you see politically. Rural areas are more conservative. Urban areas, particularly college towns, are more progressive. The coasts are more progressive, and the Midwest and South are more conservative. And I use these terms conservative and progressive and liberal. And I don't know if those mean anything, but they're just markers to make the conversation faster, right? So I would accept any footnote you want to put with any of those titles. But the reality is our country is completely polarized right now politically. I don't know if you've noticed that. Has anybody watched the news the last 10 years? My hope is that the church would stand up against the polarization in our country and offer a witness of how you live together with difference. Because we do it in the local church. I've never been to a local church where everyone agrees with me. I will say at every local church I've been to, I've given people every opportunity to agree with me. Amen? And even reminded people the world would be a better place if everyone agreed with me. But I've never gotten everyone to agree with me. And we still love each other and serve each other in the local church. I've never had anyone say, I'm not fixing a casserole for that guy, he was too conservative. Right? That's not how it works. We do well at the local church level. We don't do well at the national level. That's true. That's true here, isn't it? Our local governments tend to get things done pretty well. The state goes down a notch, several notches if you're in Kansas. And the federal government's at complete paralysis. So we know how to do it at the local level, and asking the general church to tell the annual conferences how to do disaffiliations again, we just don't want to continue. In part because every church that is very traditional and very anti-gay has already left. They're the first people out the door. Only half of the churches that left joined the Global Methodist Church that wanted to be Methodist. The other half that left, many of them were just opportunists who saw an opportunity to take their property and their pastor and not be accountable to the church anymore and not pay any apportionments. So we don't want to reopen the door for opportunism. The folks who are against homosexuality have left, and now we need to leave it to the annual conferences to handle if churches want to leave or not on a local basis and not have another global statement. So we're pushing pretty hard to end 2553. So those are our three priorities: remove the language, adopt regionalization, and not renew disaffiliations. The voting, in 2019, I was a big advocate. In fact, Mainstream started in 2018 to pass the One Church Plan. If any of you remember what that was, it was basically regionalization light, right? Because it only required a majority vote. Well, we lost that vote by 50 votes and instead adopted the traditional plan by the same 50 votes that has created a huge blowback in the U.S. about that traditional plan. The reason I think we have the majority now is if we lost by 50 votes, we only needed 26 people to change their mind. Well, there was so much outrage in the U.S. after the traditional plan was passed in 2019. 4 months later, at the annual conference sessions in the U.S., many people who identified as traditional lost their delegate seats to centrists and progressives. And we picked up more than 26 seats just in that spring. Then with disaffiliations, we've had a large number of the more traditional folks who have left have resigned their position at the General Conference, and those have been backfilled with centrists and progressives. There are about 20 delegates coming who are only pseudo-United Methodists who are coming to cause problems. And their primary goal is to pass disaffiliation to help more people to continue to break up the church. That's really their goal, is to continue to break up the church. We have one of those in our delegation in Great Plains. But this, we picked up more votes, so I'm confident that we have the majority vote needed to remove the language. I'm not confident that we have 2/3 to pass regionalization. The reality is, if Africa doesn't vote for regionalization, it can't pass. And we can't just have a majority, it's got to be 2/3. We need to move to consensus. And I say this politically all the time. If you lead by consensus, and it falls down, and this is what churches try to do. If we lead by consensus and it breaks down, you default to majority. But if your only goal is to win a majority vote, which is everybody in Topeka and everybody in D.C., if your only goal is to get to a majority and you fall short, you end up in deadlock, which is where our church is right now. We're just stuck in deadlock. I can ask, Pastor, if we're going to do a capital campaign. Everybody love capital campaigns in Lawrence First? Yeah, let's hear it. If you're going to have a vote to do a capital campaign and you get a 51% vote, you're not doing it. You're going to stop because you don't have consensus. You have half the people that don't want it. So reaching consensus is really how the best churches are led. It's how the best things happen. We need a consensus across the world that regionalization is the right place to go. And really, we have that in the U.S. All 5 U.S. jurisdictions passed aspirational messages saying we support regionalization. Many annual conferences in the U.S. have passed aspirationally those by 80% margins. So we definitely have a consensus in the U.S. that we want to remove the language and that we want to move to regionalization. We really need the votes outside of the United States to make that happen. So what we're doing to advocate for this is we're going around and sharing the message with anyone that'll sit still long enough to hear it about why we're doing this, and trying to encourage people to reach out to delegates to encourage folks to vote to remove the language. There are two schools of thought. One is, if we remove the language, it'll make Africa mad and they won't vote for regionalization. The other school of thought is, if we remove the language, it'll make Africa mad and they will insist on regionalization to get more distance, right? We're pretty confident that when we remove the language, it will make Africa mad, right? So there have been some that thought, well, we can just wait. Well, I can tell you this. We've grieved the 25% of our church we've lost from the right through disaffiliation. Friends, we've lost 25% from the left over the last 30 years because of our policies. And if we don't remove the language this time, the exodus from the left is only going to accelerate. We cannot afford to wait any longer to remove this language. It's hurting our church. It's hurting our witness in this country. And the last thing we need is to have newspapers across the country again to tell everyone that the United Methodist Church is anti-gay. It absolutely has to end. So we need to remove that language regardless of what happens. And then we need to push for regionalization. We asked traditionalists in the U.S. if regionalization created enough space. Your conference can be conservative. Your church can be conservative. Will you allow other churches to be centrist and progressive? And the answer from evangelicals in the United States was no. It has to be our rules or we're leaving, right? And they weren't kidding. 25% have left. So it tends, my expectation is the folks in Africa are more conservative than the folks in the U.S. Of the 26 countries in Africa where we have United Methodist churches, 16 of those countries, homosexuality is illegal. And in 3 of those countries, it's punishable by death. So when we think about the world we're living in, you go to Africa and talk about ordination and marriage and people's hair catches on fire, right? It's just a whole different conversation. But we also need the United Methodist Church over there to stand up against killing people, right? That's a step. So we're reaching out to African delegates. We're trying to encourage regionalization. There is good reason to do it. We're also asking them not to impose disaffiliations on us again. We don't want that. And we're trying to hold our global mission together. So the question I often get asked is, why even do regionalization? Why try to hold the whole church together? I believe it's about our global mission. I mean, the elephant in the room at General Conference is 99.4% of all money that goes into the global budget for the United Methodist Church comes from U.S. churches. 99.4%. And I don't know how many Americans you know, but the Americans I know, I don't know any American who's liberal enough or conservative enough to turn over their checkbook to somebody else. And it might be the money that breaks the church in the name of Jesus. No church has ever argued about money before, have they? That may be the issue that breaks it. But that's a real pressure that's coming right now. So there is tension in the General Conference about how people are going to vote, what the movement forward is. There are groups in Africa who have equated regionalization with homosexuality. And the message is very simple. If you're pro-gay, you're pro-regionalization. If you're anti-gay, you're anti-regionalization. And we know this from our own politics. People who speak in sound bites are very effective in communicating, and those of us who speak in paragraphs often get left behind. So that's the messaging that's happening right now. And it's a whole worldview that's black and white, and we see it in this country, we see it around the world. And in politics, I say this all the time, the difference between black and white in politics is gray, and we have to live in the gray. In the church, I believe the difference between black and white is grace. And I really want to encourage the church to move to a place of grace outside of the polarization so that we can move forward. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll open it up to questions, is so what if none of this happens? What if in the unlikely event we leave General Conference with nothing happening? There's a group of us who are working on Plan B, which probably looks like UMC USA. Now, that would be very complicated to get to, and there are a couple of different paths to get to a U.S. church. But it is possible that the U.S. annual conferences could join together and create the UMC USA, in which case we would declare our autonomy from the rest of the world, and then the rest of the world would become autonomous, or they could stick together and do whatever they want, but that the U.S. churches would actually leave. That's very messy and very complicated, but it's also a statement that we need to be able to reach our mission field, and we're not okay not being able to reach our mission field, and that there's a movement. Now, I will say UMC USA matches the same political structure of the Lutherans, Presbyterians, UCC, and Episcopalians. So it's not like it's never been done before, but it is how other denominations work it. We are the largest, we have two interesting statistics. We are the largest church in the world that ordains women that does not ordain gay and lesbian persons. And we are the largest church in the world trying to do a democratic global governance. Now, you might note the Catholic Church does global governance, but it's not democratic. So we're the only ones trying to do that. And what we're seeing are the limitations of that based on culture. So this is a big piece of what we're looking at. We're hoping to have some outline of what UMC USA looks like before we get to General Conference. We didn't have a plan B in 2019, and when we got stuck with the traditional plan, we were all stuck flat-footed. So we're working very hard with a coalition around the country to think about what we can do next, and to present that up front, not as a threat, but as a reality about where we are. And we need to be clear about where we are. As they say, clarity is kindness. And we need to be clear about where we are in the U.S. church. So that's a lot of facts and figures, and it gives you hopefully a view of how complicated it is. But General Conference convenes the last week in April and the first week of May. It's 2 weeks. And we are headed there soon. So if you have any questions, I'd be glad to open it up. And I should preface it by saying I prefer easy questions. So put that in the hopper. Yes?
How can we educate the African delegates to what's happening in the U.S.?
Well, it's hard. It's hard in part because, and there are a lot of layers to this, the General Conference has failed to produce a list of delegates. So we don't even know who the delegates are outside the United States. I can find every delegate in the U.S. and Western Europe because the annual conference has published the list. And then there's a thing called, I don't know if you've heard of Google. I have every email and contact information for every delegate in the U.S. and in Western Europe. But we have to know who they are, and we can't get that information. So even getting information to delegates in Africa is hard. This time, the difference is most of the bishops in Africa are advocating for regionalization, whereas they did not come out forcefully in support of the one church plan. So we're a little more hopeful that that can happen, but informing people about where we are is very hard to do. And it's part of the reason which makes us think, do we even have a chance? I also know this. We stated clearly our position for evangelicals in the U.S., and there was no misunderstanding. It was a disagreement, and they said, we're leaving. So even if we were able to get our message to folks in Africa, that doesn't mean that we would stay together.
So you mentioned that we had one of our delegates from our conference was in the group that you described as they just want to throw hand grenades in the mix. Remind me the process for how we choose our delegates.
That's an excellent question. So Lawrence First United Methodist Church gets delegates. You get one delegate. Each of your appointed clergy is a delegate, and you get an equal number of lay people based on the number of appointed clergy you have here. So you have 3 delegates. You have 3 clergy, so you get 3 lay, so you get 6 people. Yep. So you have 6 delegates to annual conference, which is Great Plains, Kansas, and Nebraska. We go the year before General Conference is supposed to happen. Those delegates from around the churches in our conference elect the specified number, and we get 7 clergy and 7 lay people from Great Plains. Back in the Kansas East days, we had 3 and 3, and Kansas West had 3 and 3, and Nebraska, I think, had 2 and 2. But now that we've combined, we have 1 delegation at 7 and 7. So we elect the delegates. There is no provision in the Book of Discipline for an annual conference recalling a delegate that's unhelpful, which is not okay. Every other office in the world you can recall elected officials, except notably a U.S. Senator. Actually, there's no way to recall a U.S. Senator, but you can recall anybody else from the local level all the way up to the federal level. So that's how we elect delegates. The conference chooses your delegates, and I've been an alternate or a delegate since 2000, so I've been to 6 general conferences, each one more enjoyable than the previous. Here we go.
Does the annual conference direct the delegate how to vote? Because as a layperson to your annual conference, you vote well, it used to be you voted your mind. The church didn't tell you how to vote. But I'm wondering how that works at general conference.
So people often differentiate between a representative and a delegate, that a representative is supposed to represent the body that sends them, and a delegate is assigned to go do their own thing. I don't know that differentiation holds up much. I think they're kind of the same thing. You could split that hair if you wanted to. But we have no authority or expectation that we can tell people how to vote when they get there. One of the things that I don't like is all the voting at General Conference is secret ballot. You have electronic voting machines and you don't know how people vote. I think that's wrong. You're elected by a body and they deserve to know how you voted. And you should see it. Of course, I've lived in public politics where you publish everything online and there's nowhere to hide, nor should there be. So I don't like the secret balloting that goes on at General Conference. I think it's unhelpful and it creates a lot of games. Yeah.
So disaffiliation, was that a U.S. only thing? Did these conservative African churches not disaffiliate?
So this is a very important question. The language in paragraph 2553, again, it was called the gracious exit, that was designed for the, quote, liberal churches to leave the church. And ironically, it's been what those who call themselves traditional have used to leave. The traditional plan was adopted. All of it falls within the paragraphs that are adjustable by paragraph 101. It also says 2553, part of the way it was passed, because the traditionalists wrote it and adopted it. It's their legislation 100%. They put in it that it would not take effect in Africa or outside the U.S. until a year after the next general conference, which was a compromise because folks in Africa don't want disaffiliation. And so that was a compromise line that was put in there. Well, it was decided that, it says it can't happen outside the U.S. The irony of this is paragraph 101 says they can erase that line and do it anyway, right? Or they can just take it and put it in another place. I mean, they're not bound by the decision of 2553. It did say U.S. only. Now, there have been churches that have disaffiliated from outside the U.S., and all of Eastern Europe has disaffiliated. The Judicial Council actually reviewed the process by which Eastern Europe left and said it's illegal. And they said in the next line, there's no way to stop them, right? Because if you're outside the United States and you say, we're done, what are we going to do? Who's going to sue an African annual conference for their property? No one. And in what court, right? So it did not apply specifically to them, but it could have if they had wanted it to. It could have if they wanted it to.
Possibility of a UMC USA. It would seem to me that is a very powerful threat. Not that I'm necessarily against threats, but I just wondered, does Africa understand this work that you're involved in?
We're publishing it to everyone that we have information for. I have all the bishops' emails, and I get frequent commentary back from the bishops. And as many emails we have and contact information we have outside the U.S., I send it to everybody. So we are communicating the intent and the plan that if we agree that we can't get along, that we'll do our own thing. So we're trying to communicate that far and wide. And we want to do a resolution at General Conference that says this is an intention that we have should we not be able to do regionalization. As deeply as I can get into it, yes, but it's hard to get information in. But yes, we're communicating that to everyone. And there's similar groups. You hear this in the U.S. a lot. This very black and white thinking of, well, we're right and you're wrong. That's the kind of the conservative evangelical mantra in this country. And that there's no gray for this. So if you're pro-gay, you're a sinner. If you're teaching pro-gay, you have an extra layer of hell. Really, I'm not sure how that works because the Bible doesn't really talk about layers of hell. I think that was Dante, but we're splitting hairs here. But the idea that I've heard the message from many in Africa. We cannot be a part of a church that ordains gay people. We will leave. If you ordain gay people, we will leave. Well, we're already ordaining gay people, and we've had some very effective leadership in our churches with gay people, so we're going to continue. And regardless of what the discipline says, we're going to continue in this country. So we have communicated that as clearly as we can, and the message we get back from some is, if there's any affirmation of homosexuality, we have to leave. And some will say it's out of fear that their church could be persecuted in their country if they're a part of a denomination that ordains gay people. Now, here's the reality. There are Lutheran, Presbyterian, and UCC churches in Africa who receive mission money from the U.S., and those churches have not been burned down, even though all of those denominations ordain gay and lesbian people. So part of it's hyperbole, part of it's real fear, and so we're trying to communicate where we're headed.
You mentioned that you had your 3 priorities and kind of talked about if the first one happens, then this will lead to the second one. Do we know for sure if they're going to be in that order, that they'll be presented or talked about in General Conference, or?
So General Conference is a super complicated legislative process. In a regular General Conference, all legislation has to go to a committee. The committee has to vet it, and then they grind up the sausage in extra time, and then they send it to the floor. At a specially called General Conference like 2019, it's only the one agenda item, and everything came directly to the floor without going to committees. So the one church plan and the traditional plan were debated in the committee of a whole, and no more efficient way to debate something than with 862 of your closest friends speaking 7 different languages, right? It's complicated. So this is a regularly called General Conference, a regularly scheduled one, which means everything goes to committee first. There is one committee that has a superpower. It's called the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters. That group has drafted the comprehensive regionalization piece, and they are the one group that can bring legislation directly to the floor of General Conference without going through committee. We're wanting them to do that because the General Conference has already assigned regionalization to 3 different committees. This is the other problem. They get assigned to committees based on the paragraph they address, not the topic they address. So this group of paragraphs gets this. So regionalization touches different sections of the discipline, so it's going to 3 different committees, which means they're not necessarily talking to each other, and a change here could undermine a change over here, right? So what we're trying to do is hold the regionalization together. We'd like the standing committee to bring it to the floor before committees and let us vote on that before we do anything else. That would be ideal. The removal of the language is less problematic that it goes to committees because it does fall in a bunch of different areas and the goals are the same of just removing the language. No one's suggesting changing the language, just removing it. So that's less problematic, and paragraph 2553 is all in one committee, so one committee will hash that out, and that's less problematic. So it is possible that we could, and if we have consensus, we can do anything we want. If we had a consensus, we could bring all the regionalization legislation to the floor, but it'd take a 2/3 vote to do it. And if we had the 2/3 vote to do that, that means we have the 2/3 vote to pass it. So it is, we may know in the first couple days how fraught that legislation is if we can bring it to the floor together. But we're going to try to do that strategically. The other strategic piece we're trying to do, and Mainstream's not going to weigh in on every petition. There are 1,000+ petitions to the General Conference because we allow any individual who's a United Methodist to submit legislation. I'm going to go on record, that's a mistake. If it's not approved by an annual conference, I don't think it should come to the global body. That's my own humble opinion, because we're just killing, burning, as my grandpa said, we're just burning daylight, dealing with everybody's pet peeve. But, and I've said this in a lot of places, the church is hard on a good day. Right? There's cultural shift happening in our world. You know, this is a 500-year reset based on what it means to be the church. And we have tremendous cultural transition going on. COVID-19 accelerated that transition maybe by 10 years. We've got our work cut out for us here. So we need to find a way to move forward. And the General Conference petitions, we need to address issues of itinerancy, which is the movement of pastors, right? We need to address issues of church growth and church development. We need to look at the whole church process. But we've been hamstrung as a church for a generation because every vote that comes to General Conference becomes a proxy vote on pro-gay or anti-gay. So we need to reorganize all of our general agencies, which are very complex organizations. But we can't do it when we're fighting. And so my method is, if you are going in for surgery that's life-saving, and you show up and you have a fever of 102, they're going to send you home. You can't have surgery when you're sick, right? We need to do surgery on our church, but we can't do it while we're fighting. We've got to get healthy. We've got to stop the fight about homosexuality. And I'm pretty sure gay people are tired of being talked about. Pretty sure? Pretty sure? And the reality is, it might be about power and money. It might not even be about homosexuality. So we need to stop this fight and this brokenness so that we can address all the challenges that are facing our church. But we've been paralyzed, just like Congress is paralyzed. The only thing the House of Representatives have done this year is name post offices. Right? It's completely paralyzed. That's our church. We can't, and I don't even think we could name a post office right now, honestly. I don't think we could accomplish that much. So we've got to stop the fighting, move from conflict-driven church to a mission-driven church. And then I think we need to table all of our petitions and refer them to the U.S. region to sort out. And just focus on these three topics. We got to remove the language, we've got to get regionalization, and we've got to stop the disaffiliations. And then we'll have the next 12 years to build the church we want to all live in, that makes the most sense to do. So that's one of the things I am advocating for. Yes?
And I would say amen to that. There has been in the news, and your remarks about it, about the disorganization that has been involved with people receiving information about General Conference. And the question involved, does that impact Africa even more, and how maybe that might affect all of this? And I also read that your two sisters are still keeping you in line.
Yes, that's right. Little known fact, Larry Fry confirmed me at Countryside United Methodist when I was 12 years old. So you have him to blame for it. But Yeah, the General Conference disorganization, we have a secretary of the General Conference who has not done a good job communicating or planning this. Typically, for all the other General Conferences I've been to, we receive hotel, flight, and food information in November before the April start date, almost 6 months ahead of time. As of 2 weeks ago, we had none of that information. What he's referring to is I had the UM News quoted me saying, if I planned a family reunion like that with just 30 of us, my sisters would beat me with a stick, right? And both of my sisters read that and said, that's right. That is exactly right. So we just received an email Friday with hotel and flight procedures. But it's so disorganized. Would you buy flights for 1,000 people 8 weeks out? Or would you do that 6 months out? Right? It doesn't make any sense. The impact, though, is going to be much greater in Africa. Many of the delegates there have still not received, about 20% of the delegates in Africa have still not received their letter of invitation, which is required to get a visa. And then they have to have the money. It's about $200 to apply for a visa, which most could not be expected to have, and so they need to send the money so they can apply for a visa, and then they can't buy a plane ticket until they have a visa. And so the cost of those plane tickets is just going up while we're waiting on all this stuff. So it's not fair to the delegates outside the United States. And this is a very real piece. Every year at General Conference, there's usually 30 to 40 delegates from outside the U.S., mostly in Africa, who are not able to get visas. And the visa application process is not fair, you'll be surprised to know. If you've been to the U.S. before and have come back to Africa, it expedites it dramatically. If you've used a visa before and come back, then you're considered more trustworthy, right? But if you're a first-time applicant and you've never been outside the country, then you're viewed with more suspicion that you might just be trying to illegally immigrate, and so the State Department makes it much harder. So the reality is, if we have double or triple that number of people that can't get visas or don't end up attending, well, the votes we want probably go our way. But the legitimacy of the whole General Conference is in question because all the delegates aren't there, right? And that's a very real piece. And it only takes half the delegates showing up to be a quorum. But conducting business with 20% of the delegates from Africa not there is not going to be viewed as fair or legitimate by anybody. So that's a whole nother layer to this that is yet unseen.
I'm going to ask a question, then I'll give it to you, Barb. I'm wondering about the transparency at the General Conference. Those of us that are back here, is there any, like, a C-SPAN for General Conference
Yes,
that we can watch what's going on?
There is. If you have trouble sleeping at night, I encourage you to record it. But yes, they do live stream all the plenary. The committees, they don't live stream. I think just logistically. They could. Nowadays, right? You can live stream very quickly. So there's 10 different committees. They could set up 10 cameras and live stream those as well. I'm pretty sure they're not going to. They've never done that before. And if we've never done it before. But I do know all the main plenary meetings are live streamed, and you can watch those online. And I'll be doing a regular blog, which you can follow as well, I will promise you this, it will always be entertaining. It might not be entirely accurate, but it'll be fun. So if you signed up, so I'll make my pitch now. I do ask if you would like to contribute to Mainstream UMC. You have cards. Everyone gets a free souvenir for coming tonight. There are more out on the table. We'd love to have your support for the work that we're doing. We just have about 8 weeks left before General Conference, and we function entirely by donations. There are also donation envelopes out there, or you can donate online. Also, there are sign-up sheets by the front door. So if you sign up for that, you'll get my emails. If you signed up and didn't realize that and you want to scratch your name out on the way out, you can do that too. But that's what the signups out by the front door are. So you can get all of those. Yes.
Okay, I have a question. I had just worked with doing a program for United Women of Faith, Methodist Women, about the history of them and finances. And I was looking at the 2022 financial report for United Women of Faith and saw that there's a serious drop in revenues. And it looked like almost to the point of deficit, probably because of prior commitments. I'm not exactly sure. And it seemed like they were saying maybe like 23 out of 53 pay their apportionments. I mean, it looks like it's pretty serious financially. What's happening with the financial piece of this at this point?
That's a good question. What's happening financially? So we've had 25% of the churches leave. That means that we have a budget loss of at least 25% if it were proportional. We also know that COVID has hit churches hard in terms of income and what churches are able to pay. The General Council on Finance and Administration, I only know it by its initials, so I have to think about what it stands for, GCFA. That group has recommended a 40% cut to the overall budget of the global church because of disaffiliations. I think that's too aggressive, personally, but it's probably not bad to build back up, right? But the loss of revenue is real based on the loss of churches. And in Great Plains, as I said, we only lost about 10% of our budget with disaffiliations. Other conferences have lost half or more. So there are conferences that have been hit very hard. And I think we only had 2 churches in Great Plains, and I could be corrected on this, but I think we only had 2 churches with over 400 in attendance that left. In the South, they have big churches in the South that walked out the door. So a lot of large revenue churches have left. So the budget deficit is real, and it's a factor of what we're doing, which is another reason why we need to reorganize our whole agency structure, because I don't think just doing the same thing with 40% less revenue is necessarily the right way. Maybe we should do something different. But it's not been safe to have those conversations. And so I think we need to get through this so that we can address it. And make sure we're spending, money's hard to come by in the church. I don't know if that's true at Lawrence First, but money's hard to come by in the church, and we need to be making sure we're good stewards of it at the national level. So I think it's a real issue.
So is there any strategy to prevent the reintroduction of this language if regionalization can't be achieved?
Okay, so I'm glad you brought that up. I'm not glad you brought it up, but it's an important question. So if we're going to pass regionalization, we need 2/3 vote at General Conference. But because they are constitutional amendments, they have to be ratified by, and this language is very specific, ratified by 2/3 vote of all annual conferences membership present and voting. So while I said the U.S. has 55% of the votes right now, worldwide we're only 45% of the votes when it comes to ratification by annual conference, right? So our percentage has already dropped from what we need at General Conference versus what we need for ratification. Ratification is very hard. There were provisions for regionalization in 2012 that, that's when we passed paragraph 101, but there were efforts to make it reciprocal. Those passed in 2012 and were not ratified. We also passed a radical constitutional amendment in 2016 that said, and I hope you're sitting down, that women are equal to men in the eyes of God. Crazy talk, yes? It passed at 2/3 vote at General Conference. It failed in ratification. That's how hard it is. So the ratification piece is very difficult. So your question about, restate your question. Oh, could it be reintroduced?
Yeah, essentially when the numbers flip back
That's
the
right.
other way, is
Thank
there
you.
a way to stop it from coming back?
So all that to say, it's very possible that we remove the language. I think that's very possible. I'm very optimistic we're going to remove the language. I think we could get to 2/3 at General Conference to pass regionalization. I think ratification is very hard, in part because there are others who control the messaging in Africa more than I do. a lot more who say regionalization is pro-gay, vote against regionalization if you're anti-gay. So I think it's very plausible that regionalization fails at ratification, and we won't know for a year. And it's plausible that folks could come back when the votes have flipped and reintroduce all of the prohibitions. I'm guessing that the U.S. church will not be around for that to happen, that will already be a UMC USA before that language is reintroduced. I think that's very plausible, but it is a real issue that everything we do could be undone in 4 years. Now, the bishops have called a special session in 2 years. That special session, by definition, has to retain the vote count of the previous General Conference. So it's possible there's another session in 2 years, but that has to be specific issues. The one in 2028 is where the numbers flip, when there's a new regularly scheduled General Conference. But this special session in 26 could keep the percentages the same. It's complicated, isn't it?
Comment on the subject of paralysis, and call me trivial, but we are on the verge of the longest stretch in my lifetime or the lifetime of my parents without a hymnal revision.
Without a what?
A hymnal revision. That's the kind of day-to-day paralysis that we're talking about if we can't get past this.
I'm not hearing the word you're using.
Hymnal revision.
Hymnal revision.
Remember when there were knockdown dragouts at General Conference about
I
Lord
love
of the Dance
that.
and Onward Christian
Can I tell you how much
Soldiers?
I miss fighting about music?
But that's part of the paralysis, right?
Well,
That's
let me just tell you, too,
affecting our
you
day-to-day
kick out all the
lives.
gay people, and how's that revision going to go? I mean, this is the issue.
No music,
We're willing to use gay people's talent, but not give full affirmation. And that makes me crazy. We're willing to use talent. You know, you can be a musician and be out, and we'll use you for worship. It's so unfair. But the hymnal revision is still on the table. It's still on the table, but honestly, until we get this resolved, I don't know how it moves forward. I don't know how it moves forward. Yeah. Yes. Here she comes.
Mark Miller says hi, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
He's was a United Methodist musician. He has now left the United Methodist Church.
And you would recognize a lot of his work.
An extraordinary amount of work. It seems to me that the African churches would be loath to be against regionalization because the United Methodist Church in the United States funds a significant part of the ministries of the African churches. And if we were to go to regionalization, they may suffer financially. Reality is that they will not get the kinds of funds they're getting now from the Global Methodist Church, even though it's primarily people who have gone to the Global Methodist Church or independent churches who really bought the votes of the African churches many years ago. And so it's just a complex picture that seems to me the African church may suffer significantly no matter which way we go.
Yeah. Well, and I'll start with the first part of what you said. Mark Miller, great musician, United Methodist, was asked by the General Conference to lead worship and music at General Conference. This beautiful, wonderful music ministry that he has, while they're denying the rights to gay people. I mean, the disconnect was mind-blowing. And I can't think of anyone who was more gracious in the midst of that than Mark Miller at General Conference when all this was happening. Because after these votes come down, he came up on the stage to lead worship. Can you imagine? So a great human being. Thank you for bringing up his name. The other piece of the loss of revenue, there are two schools of thought in Africa. Some would say, we want to stay in partnership. And others would say, God will provide. So if we lose the revenue from the U.S. church, that's fine. It is true that half the Methodists in Africa survive without U.S. money. So it's not as though the churches are not able to raise resources. It would look different. My biggest issue about the global mission is I like the way we do global mission. We only fight about it every 4 years. And then it's in the budget and people can count on it, right? You can count on the budget for that. We also have the General Board of Global Ministries that vets ministries around the world. So when you give to a mission and ministry somewhere else, you have great confidence that money is going for what it said it would and that the work's doing good work. So we have a very intricate system of doing mission well. I don't want to go back to the old days, and this is what the Global Methodist Church is going back to, of busking for mission, right? I actually learned this word last year, and I'm really excited to use it in a sentence. But busking is where you play the guitar on the street corner and people give you money, right? Performing for money on the street. Well, that's how mission used to be. You got to send your choir over from Africa to the big church and hope they give you a nice donation. That's patronizing to me. It's a patronizing way to do mission, and it's all based on performance, and it's based on who has the loudest voice or is the most politically savvy, rather than who's doing the most impactful ministry. So going back to busking for mission, I think is a bad choice. It may be the choice that everyone chooses. But if we can do regionalization, we can hold our global mission together. I haven't heard anyone from the U.S. say who doesn't believe those who have much, from those who have much, much is required, right? We believe that. And I haven't heard anyone say we're not willing to continue to fund the churches outside the United States. What I have heard is we're not willing to not have control of the outreach in our own mission field. That's what's not okay. And so that's, I think, the change that we need to make in terms of regionalization. But there's a lot at stake. The general church budget pre-COVID in 2018 was $135 million a year. So that's what, my math is bad, $550 million per 4 years. 99.4% of that coming from the U.S. churches. So there's a dramatic loss of revenue should this come to pass. And what the Global Methodist Church has decided, we're going to fund $0 and 0 cents for global ministry, and we're going to require everyone to have an individual relationship with an annual conference or a local church in order to be funded. Then it's based on personality and performance rather than ministry. So I'd like us not to go back, but that's what's at stake. Any other questions?
Back to disaffiliation. Did we lose bishops over this? Bishops are elected for life. Could they remain a United Methodist bishop in our political system and actively support the globals?
So I will tell you, our former Bishop Scott Jones, while he was in Texas, drew a salary from the United Methodist Church while he set up the Global Methodist Church so that he could become a bishop upon retirement. So I have a real problem with the bishops who used their position in we basically funded his work to set up the Global Methodist Church. With integrity, as soon as he knew he was going to go Global Methodist, he should have resigned from this church or retired. He could have retired and then gone and become a bishop. But what he did is he waited, and he did his work for years. And I called him out multiple times. If you've been following me for any length of time, I called out Scott Jones multiple times for being a GMC bishop, which he denied vehemently. And it all came to pass. And now he's teaching at a Baptist seminary, which is more appropriate. But his book, he was the extreme center. He's just become the center of the extreme. And so he used his position. Mark Webb in New York did the same thing. Mike Lowry in Central Texas did the same thing. And if you look at the annual conferences that were hit the hardest by disaffiliations, it was the bishops who were setting up the GMC who took the most churches with them. So I would say there was an integrity issue with some of the bishops in the U.S. who chose to stay UMC until the GMC was ready to take them. The same thing's happening with at least one bishop in Africa, Bishop Johanna in Nigeria. I've written about him. He's working hard to take all that property GMC. And instead of resigning to become GMC, here's the other issue. Bishop Johanna is not eligible for re-election. It's limited in Africa. It's not a lifetime appointment. But he can't run for bishop again. Unless he takes the church GMC, then he can be bishop for life. So there's some real integrity issues that goes all the way to the top. There are pastors that did the same thing, who were GMC pastors and stayed in to work to get their church to leave and get the votes and then to get the church out and to be able to keep their appointment. So there's some bad acting that has gone on that we just need to say out loud and not be bashful about talking about. But Scott Jones was one of the folks who did the most damage to the church on his way out. Yes? He does get his pension because federal law governs pension plans. And even if you fire somebody, they get what's accumulated, right? So he gets what he earned as a United Methodist bishop. So he'll be on our payroll for the rest of his life. Even though he has withdrawn from ministry as a United Methodist. But he's on the Global Methodist webpage now. You can see his picture as a Global Methodist bishop, which was his plan all along. I don't know how all that works. I don't know how much. He asked if he receives the health benefits as well. I don't know. I think he's fine. I think he'll make it.
Do they use the connectional system, or are they autonomous?
Well, they're kind of a hybrid. They originally were going to have, they're trying to set up an appointment system similar. They were going to have very low apportionments. They're realizing they were too low and they can't actually do anything. So they are setting up kind of a hybrid system. The original Book of Discipline said that the churches recruit and hire their own pastors, and the bishop just makes sure they're not gay. And then I paraphrase. But they're making changes to that where the bishops are actually making the appointments. But it's a hybrid system now. And they don't have a trust clause that says the property belongs to, you know who put in the trust clause? John Wesley, that said all property was held in common by the annual conference. So that's the part that's what 2553 did. 2553 suspended the trust clause for a minute, and now it's back, and they want to suspend it again. So yeah, the GMC their Book of Discipline is online. If you want to go read it. I've not read it all.
Is there a plan to bring back in those disaffiliated churches if they decide their way was not the way that they should have gone?
There are already provisions for churches to join an annual conference, which simply includes putting a trust clause into your deed and taking a vote and the annual conference voting to receive you. It's a pretty straightforward process. There are some efforts right now to make a statement of welcoming churches back that change their mind, to make it more proactive. The discussion is going to come, churches had to pay something of their pension liability to get out. I don't know if any annual conference is going to voluntarily give that money back if they come back. I do know this from district superintendents in this conference. They have received calls already from disaffiliated churches that said, hey, we need our new pastor now. Zoinks. They didn't read the fine print. Actually, that's the bold print where you left. That's in bold, right? So, and all that entails. But yeah, that's happening. But I think there is an effort to bring churches back who want to rejoin.
Just a quick question. In the Great Plains Annual Conference, 25% of the churches disaffiliated. Most of them were rural churches. How many of them, are you aware of, how many of them received financial support from the annual conference in order to exist as a local church?
I don't know those numbers off the top of my head. I do know that the Global Methodist Church does not offer additional compensation for churches, equitable compensation for churches that have a pastor that aren't able to pay it. We had that, the Global Methodist Church does not. So I don't know the numbers of how much the conference. I will say smaller local churches did not, by and large, cost the conference a lot of money. They weren't mostly a burden on the conference financially. So I would say it's probably, if there is a number that's more than zero. Well, they depend, yes, and I just don't know the percentage, but I would guess that most of the small churches did not receive compensation from the conference. Some would have if it were designated as a missional opportunity. I do know this, in a lot of conferences around the country, there's a lot of ethnic churches that were receiving a lot of money from their annual conferences, mission sites, who have decided to disaffiliate, and they've lost all of those resources. So that's been a big deal in other annual conferences as well. All right, well, we're at about an hour and a half, which is about what people can tolerate from me, is my experience. And usually the pastor starts walking towards me and then stands really close to get me to stop talking. So I'll preempt that and just say thank you again for the opportunity to come. Again, I would invite you to sign up to receive updates through General Conference. And
Our rocks are falling.
I actually wondered if those were real rocks, and now I know the answer. So I'm grateful. Yes.
Well, Mark, I want to make sure we all thank you, but I wanted to first thank our AV support here. They have been behind the scenes and made this seamless. So thank you. Thank you. And thank you. Thank you for coming today and providing all this incredible information. Okay?
Thank you, Mark. We appreciate it a lot.
You bet. Thank you.
And if you, he may stick around, right? Did you say that already? Yeah, stick around for a few minutes if you have any other comments or questions that you'd like to talk to Mark about. We do have youth group coming in here in a little while, and so if any of you can hang around and help us put tables and chairs away in preparation for the youth group, we'd really appreciate it. And if not, we understand that too. And for those of you who are not from our church who came and joined us today, thank you for coming and being here. We're glad that you took advantage of that, so thank you very much.
And Pastor, would you pray us out of here?
I'd be glad to. They enjoy it when I do that. 20 minutes from now, we'll be done. Here we go. Holy God, there are so many issues swirling around, and yet we know that you are a good and gracious and a loving God. And so we just ask that you help us to be clear about who you are and the love that you give to each and every one of us. Guide all the delegates that are coming to General Conference. Let your Spirit be over that place, we pray. And just help us to bring your peace to our world. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, but they're only active with the remaining.